Good afternoon, everybody, and we'll call this hearing to order. And I'm very pleased today to welcome Howard Shalansky, who's the new administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. The Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs is charged with the critical role of reviewing significant regulations and overseeing agencies' review of existing regulations. Over the last 4 years, regulatory burdens have increased at an astonishing rate, and major rules alone have added nearly $70 billion in new regulatory costs. In fiscal year 2012, more than 3,800 final rules were issued. While expanding the regulatory estate in an unprecedented way, President Obama has also directed federal agencies to review their existing regulations. He issued 2 executive orders, one in 2011 that required agencies to draft and finalize retrospective review plans, and another in 2012 that requires federal agencies to produce retrospective review progress reports. Agencies were ordered to give special consideration to initiatives that would reduce regulatory burdens on small businesses. This makes sense because small businesses are disproportionately burdened by regulatory costs. Furthermore, in survey after survey, small businesses regularly cite concerns about the complexity and burden of red tape. The need to reevaluate our regulatory structure is clear. Last week, in the Washington Post, there was a story that ran on the front page about a magician from my home state of Missouri. This magician uses a Netherland dwarf rabbit in his magic shows for kids, and the Department of Agriculture has determined that the magician must carry a license for his rabbit, pay an annual fee, and submit to surprise inspections of his home. In addition, under a new rule finalized just last year, he's required to have a written plan detailing how he will take care of the rabbit in the event of an emergency or disaster. This rabbit disaster plan, which is being prepared with professional assistance, is 28 pages long so far. If this story wasn't on the front page of the newspaper, I would have thought it was a joke. But this is no laughing matter. This kind of story about regulatory overreach is unfortunately all too common today. Congress gives regulators an inch, and a lot of times they do take a mile, and the result is poorly thought out, unnecessary regulations that unduly burden small businesses. Today, Administrator Shalansky has joined us to discuss agency retrospective review efforts, and I look forward to hearing whether the agency's efforts are resulting in meaningful reductions in regulatory burdens, particularly for small businesses. And I also look forward to hearing how Mr. Shalansky plans to scrutinize new regulatory proposals to ensure that any negative impacts on small businesses are minimized. And with that, I turn to Ranking Member Velasquez for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Small businesses are critical to the economy, creating nearly 70% of net new jobs and generating more than 50% of GDP. While their contributions are essential to putting a real dent in the nation's unemployment rate, regulatory costs threaten to undermine this important role. While credible estimates of these costs are hard to come by, over the last 7 years, this committee has extensively examined the impact of regulations on small firms. During this time, it has become clear that although these rules provide significant benefits to the public, they are in fact creating very real challenges for a wide range of smaller companies. President Obama had addressed this matter head-on by issuing Executive Orders 13563 and 13610. Together, these mandates have the potential to bring real relief to small businesses across the country. They call for the careful reassessment, a retrospective analysis of regulations that are in place. After this evaluation has been undertaken, agencies will be in a position to streamline, modify, or eliminate rules that do not make sense in their current form or under existing circumstances. Specifically, agencies are directed to prioritize initiatives that will produce significant cost savings and reductions in paperwork burdens. As a result, small businesses will face fewer headaches in dealing with federal regulations. In May, this committee heard from agencies on their progress in implementing these orders. We learned, for the most part, that agencies are taking these requirements more seriously than they have in the past, particularly when it comes to the Section 610 requirements in the Regulatory Flexibility Act. Several agencies, from Treasury to Labor to DOT, have already issued final rules that will reduce burdens on businesses. Other changes, like those to the FAR, will help small businesses directly by reducing government bureaucracy. During today's proceedings, I am particularly interested in hearing whether these moves indicate a long overdue change to agency behavior. All too often, similar efforts have been just flushed in the pan as agencies' compliance with previous call for regulatory reduction faded quickly. While the President's initiatives is welcome, we cannot overlook the importance of the Regulatory Flexibility Act as well. It has provided an overarching structure for agencies to work within, limiting the impact on their rules on small businesses. With efforts currently underway in the Judiciary Committee to revise this important statute, we must ensure that any changes do not undermine its effectiveness. This means not heaping on the SBA's Office of Advocacy, who implements the RFA with responsibilities beyond its capacity. As a result of the sequester, this office is already struggling to make do with less, and adding more duties makes little sense. The truth is that taxpayers will be stuck with another bill, or more likely, no additional funding will be provided and the office will be unable to carry out these obligations effectively. Instead, we should be considering changes to the RFA in the areas that are most glaring, rather than rewriting the entire bill, the entire act. This includes ensuring periodic reviews become a regular part of the regulatory process and that agencies cannot evade their responsibility under the Act. It also means broadening the panel process, but in a way that makes sense in the current fiscal environment. With Administrator Shelansky here today, I am eager to not only hear about agency implementation of the retrospective review plans, but also what steps, if any, should be taken to improve the RFA. Reducing regulatory burden is a laudable, if elusive, goal. It is something that Congress, the administration, and the private sector must work toward and constantly improve as the regulatory environment evolves. With this in mind, I'm hopeful that these most recent executive orders will be a break from past efforts. Reversing these trends are essential not only to small businesses, but to the economy overall. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. The Honorable Howard Shelansky was confirmed as the Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs on June 27, 2013. Mr. Shelansky has both a Ph.D. in economics and a law degree from the University of California at Berkeley. He has served in several positions at the Federal Trade Commission, most recently as the Director of the Bureau of Economics. Mr. Shelansky has worked for the Federal Communications Commission and the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House, and he's also taught and practiced law and clerked for several notable jurists, including Supreme Court Justice Scalia. Mr. Shelansky, thank you for taking the time to be here. Your written testimony will be entered in the record in its entirety, and look forward to hearing your oral testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Velasquez, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. As Chairman Graves just mentioned, I was recently confirmed as the Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, known as OIRA, at the Office of Management and Budget, and I'm honored to be serving in this role. And I look forward to speaking with you today about the topic of retrospective regulatory review, and in particular its benefits for small businesses. Retrospective review is critical to ensuring that our regulatory system is modern, streamlined, and does not impose unnecessary burdens on the American public. Even regulations that were well crafted when first promulgated can become unnecessary over time as conditions change. Retrospective review of regulations helps to ensure that those regulations are continuing to promote health, safety, welfare, and well-being of Americans without imposing unnecessary costs. Recognizing the importance of this effort, in January 2011, the President issued Executive Order 13563, called Improving Regulation and Regulatory Review. Among other things, that executive order asks executive departments and agencies to review existing Federal regulations. and to streamline, modify, or repeal regulations and reduce unnecessary burdens and costs. As a result of that executive order, executive departments and agencies produced more than 24 plans with over 500 regulatory reform initiatives. Just a small fraction of the rules already finalized will produce billions of dollars of savings in the near term. In subsequent executive orders, the President took the additional steps of directing agencies to emphasize reforms that produce significant, quantifiable savings, and of asking the independent regulatory agencies to develop their own regulatory review plans. The Administration's retrospective review efforts are already producing significant results. For example, the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, finalized rules to remove unnecessary regulatory and reporting requirements on hospitals and other health care providers, saving more than $5 billion over the next 5 years. The Department of Labor finalized a rule to simplify and to improve hazard warnings for workers, producing net benefits of more than $2.5 billion in savings over the next 5 years while increasing safety. The Department of Labor also finalized a rule that will remove approximately 1.9 million annual hours of redundant reporting burdens on employers and save more than $200 million in costs over 5 years. And the Environmental Protection Agency finalized a rule to eliminate the obligation for many states to require air pollution vapor recovery systems at local gas stations, since modern vehicles already have effective air pollution control technologies. The anticipated 5-year savings are over $400 million. Our retrospective review efforts have focused especially on benefiting small businesses. The Department of Transportation retrospective review plan alone identifies over 24 initiatives to save money for small businesses and local governments. For example, one of DOT's initiatives would codify regulations to prevent duplicative requirements for air carrier drug and alcohol testing programs, which would be particularly helpful for small carriers. The Department of Defense issued a new rule to accelerate payments on contracts to as many as 60,000 small businesses, improving their cash flow. And the Small Business Administration is changing its rules to adopt a single electronic application to reduce the paperwork required of certain lenders, which will in turn benefit small business borrowers. This past winter, agencies focused their retrospective review updates on paperwork burden reduction. Many of the initiatives stemming from this effort will save substantial money for small businesses. For example, the Internal Revenue Service announced a simplified method for claiming the home office deduction, which will save taxpayers, particularly those with home-based small businesses, over 1.6 million hours and several $1 million in out-of-pocket costs per year. In July 2013, agencies submitted to OIRA their latest updates of their retrospective review plans, pursuant to Executive Orders 13563 and 13610. Although OIRA is still reviewing the plans and the full updates are not yet public, I can report that many of the initiatives highlighted in the updated plans benefit small businesses. For example, the Department of Housing and Urban Development is drafting a final rule that would create alternative, more streamlined financial statement reporting requirements for small supervised lenders. The rule would also eliminate duplicative reporting requirements for lenders who already report to Federal agencies. In addition, the Federal Aviation Administration is proposing a rule to update, simplify, and streamline rules of practice and procedure for filing and adjudicating complaints against federally assisted airports. Small businesses would particularly benefit from this rule, which would decrease the time spent on processing complaints by allowing parties to file electronically. Retrospective review is crucial to ensuring that we have a well-functioning regulatory system. And moving forward, I will look for further ways to institutionalize retrospective review of regulations and to ensure that retrospective review continues to produce significant cost savings for small businesses and for the American people. Thank you for your time. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Administrator. We're going to start with Representative Luke DeMeyer. You can start. We'll start with questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Shalansky, for being here today. Just got some few questions here with regards to Department of Labor is coming out with some rules and has been coming out with some rules, and I'll kind of use those as perhaps a template for how you go about your rulemaking process here. In 2010, they came out with a fiduciary rule with regards to broker-dealers and investment advisors, and they withdrew the rule again in 2011. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but it had to do with the liability exposure that they could be exposed to as a result of this rule with regards to the broker-dealers and investment advisors and how they advise their clients. And now DOL's intent to repropose the rule. In fact, you may have the rule already to review because they were going to try and do it within 90 days. You have to have it with 90 days of the rule being implemented, and they're trying to get it by the 1st of October, so you may have it already. I'm not sure, but regardless, I guess my concern is, number one, since they pulled the rule back and now going to repropose it, I assume you will get it before they do come out with a final ruling. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, and they have to go through the entire process of showing a cost-benefit analysis, what kind of problem that they're going to try is there to solve, what their solution is. That's all part of the regular process of going about this. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the review process at OIRA is very much exactly what you just described. When the regulation comes to OIRA for review, one of the jobs of the office is to make sure that the prescriptions of the relevant executive orders have been followed. And one of the, I think, centerpieces of the executive orders under which OIRA operates is cost-benefit analysis. And so any rule that comes to OIRA, whether it will be the reproposed fiduciary rule or any other regulation, where allowable by law, will be subject to this kind of cost-benefit analysis.
Okay, whenever they give you the cost-benefit analysis, do you look at it and ever tell them, hey, this is a bunch of bunk, you guys are all blowing smoke at us, this doesn't work? I want you to go back and actually do an analysis that makes sense?
So this is, in fact, very much at the heart of what OIRA does. OIRA doesn't, in the first instance, do original cost-benefit analyses. It reviews what the agencies have done, but it reviews it rigorously and critically. So information can emerge during the OIRA review process that suggests either that the cost-benefit analysis was inadequate or should be done in a different way, or as in many cases, that it was in fact done very well. But OIRA does adopt a very critical analysis of that.
Okay, in this situation, there also is a situation here where the SEC is also trying to also make a rule under a different structure, under different guidelines, different authority. And the two rules could be in conflict, and they need to be, there needs to be some collaboration here. Or do you force them to collaborate, or do you, what happens whenever they're in conflict with each other?
Mr. Lukemeier, thank you very much for that question, because I think that gets to a very important issue. I absolutely share your concern, and OMB shares your concern with duplicative or conflicting regulations. And one of the very important roles of OIRA, in addition to reviewing what the agency analysis is where appropriate to convene other agencies that might have duplicative or conflicting rules.
So do you get them in a room and say, hey, okay, you guys knock it out, or do you tell them, you reject both rules and tell them do it over, or how do you get to some sort of resolution here?
Well, I mean, there are different processes depending on the circumstance. The Securities and Exchange Commission is an independent agency and not subject to OIRA review, but of course the Department of Labor is. And so what
rules are going to have an impact on what you review.
Precisely, and so I agree with you completely. And so the job of OIRA, and my job as administrator in that case, would be to make sure that the Department of Labor, which is subject to OIRA review, is fully taking account the extent to which its rules will overlap or interoperate with the Securities and Exchange Commission's rules.
Okay, with regards to looking at the promulgation of rules, do you ever look at the letters and the testimony, the comment period that all the stuff comes into this case DOL or whomever, and say this is an unintended consequence of what you're trying to do. This is what's going to happen if you do this. And to follow up, because I'm running out of time here, do you also look at, in a case of promulgating rules from a law, do you ever look at the intent of Congress on what we're trying to get done with this law? And the hearings that we have here, and the testimony and the discussion is held on the floor as an indication of where we want to go with this law, so that when they make the rules, they don't take a turn somewhere, go off on a tangent, and make sure they stay within the cage, I call it, where they need to be to make these rules.
So let me answer your questions, starting with the one you just asked, because I think it's a very important question. The interpretation of an agency statute and the choice of policy, to the extent there is discretion under that statute, is in the first instance in the province of the department or agency that is issuing the regulation. OIRA doesn't set policy priorities or do the initial legal interpretations for the agencies. They do that. Now, of course, should there be a regulation that is not in compliance with the law, that would be something that we would be very concerned with. In terms of the comments and the public information that comes into the rulemaking process itself, that is very much the kind of information that OIRA looks at and depends on for parts of its review. Just to give you a hypothetical example, were it the case that a comment had brought interesting or credible data to the rulemaking process, and that data were not accounted for in the agency's analysis, that would lead to a question from OIRA to the agency about why not, and what would the effect of accounting for that data be. So we're very concerned that the best available information, technical data, science, economics, all factor into the rulemaking process, and public notice and comment is a very important source of that information.
I see my time is up. I appreciate the Chairman's indulgence. Thank you very much.
Ranking Member Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Shalansky, OIRA's guidance dated October 26, 2011, and entitled Implementation of Retrospective Review Plans, stated that the agency's plan should cover existing significant regulations. That is the case, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
However, several agencies have included new rules unrelated to existing regulations, as well as initiatives outside of the rulemaking process. So I would like to know, what is your position on that? And do you believe that this in any way will undermine the intent of the executive order?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Velasquez. Let me start by saying that retrospective review, in my view, and I think in the view of the President's executive orders, should undertake all agency actions that might save money for the American public and particularly for small businesses. That could include things that are not rules. For example, methods of reducing paperwork and things that might fall outside of reforming or repealing an existing regulation. And those can be extremely beneficial for small businesses. So to the extent that as part of retrospective review plans or things working under the retrospective review executive orders, I do think that it can be appropriate for agencies to expand their focus beyond
Okay, so let's say that, yes, it could be appropriate, but don't you believe that the focus of the review should be on emphasizing those rules, those existing rules?
Yes,
to relieve the burden.
Yes, I do, and that certainly is the focus of retrospective review. Now, what can be a little bit complicated in looking at the plans that the agencies put forward is that often the vehicle for changing a pre-existing rule is a new rule. And so one might look at them and say, well, this is supposed to be a retrospective review plan, and instead of seeing the words repeal, 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 we see new rules. Okay. But the effect of those new rules is to modify or change in some way pre-existing regulations.
Thank you. Administrator, every week that we hold hearings regarding any issue related to small businesses and that hinders growth in terms of small businesses, people raise regulatory and the regulatory environment and how this hinders small businesses. My question to you is, agencies have been reporting for over a year now on retrospective reviews. And we want them to do their work because it's going to show cost saving for small businesses. What is the role that sequestration play on that effort?
Well, I think that's a very important question. I can speak from OIRA's standpoint. I think the role of sequestration in general is one that constrains the ability of agencies to have as much person power as they would like to have in their various functions, and to the extent one of those functions is retrospective review, one might imagine that sequestration is having a negative effect on their ability to devote resources to that activity. But as for the specific effects on any given agency, I can't speak to that. I can, however, speak to OIRA's role in encouraging and working with the agencies and reviewing their retrospective review plans. All of OMB, OIRA included, is really at sort of a bare bones level of staffing at this point. And under sequestration, we are not in a position, never mind to add staff, but not even to backfill vacancies that are occurring. And with this extremely hardworking and dedicated staff that we have, and I really wish to say that to a person, they are outstanding and they work extremely hard. We lose some of their effort due to furlough days. And we are subject to furlough. Just for example, my staff has furlough day this coming Monday. They have a furlough day the Monday afterwards. They've had furlough days since sequestration. Okay. And that, of course, is person power that we do not have to devote to this effort.
Thank you. It has been 2 years since agencies issued their final plans and began implementing them. Are you satisfied that agencies are taking this seriously?
Thank you very much for that question. I am satisfied that they're taking it seriously, but I want to be careful with the word satisfied. I'm very encouraged by the signs that I've seen. You know, the President's executive order is only a couple of years old on retrospective review. And I think that what I have seen is an increasing engagement by the agencies in this process. So I am satisfied that it is getting traction, but I want to see more. Okay.
So my follow-up question is, we have seen executive orders before, and they come and they go. And do you believe that this time agencies are more committed than they have been in the past? Are we breaking that culture?
Well, you know, here's what I think that's a very important question. I do think that there is a culture of retrospective review and of look back that is taking hold in the agencies. Certainly, none of us want to see regulations that are getting in the way of small business, that are deterring small businesses, or that are imposing unjustified costs. We don't want to see those persisting.
Okay, so my next question. What type of oversight do you have in place to make sure that agencies will be held accountable?
Well, what OIRA does as part of this process is, first of all, we make sure that the agencies are engaging in the processes that are mandated under the President's executive orders related to retrospective review. And we've provided guidance on how to implement those executive orders. But we also require the agencies to file their reports with OIRA. In fact, in early July, all executive departments and agencies did file their reports with OIRA, showing a very serious engagement with the retrospective review process. There are a large number of initiatives that are listed on each agency's report. We're in the process of reviewing them, and those will very shortly be public on the agency's websites.
Will you be grading them?
You know, we don't grade them per se, but we provide them feedback and we try to improve their efforts.
Well, the public wants to know that they're really doing the work that they're supposed to be doing.
Right, and really the proof of that is not just the lists that they very openly will post on their websites, but it's the real dollar savings that we have seen in the past 2 years from these retrospective review efforts, which in terms of finalized rules that are retrospective and that change pre-existing regulations, we can already find $10 billion of savings to the American public, much of that savings enjoyed by small businesses. But I can also say that looking forward, there are very important rules, such as one that the Department of Transportation is going to release that is going to reduce reporting obligations of truck drivers for vehicle inspection reports and reduce daily burdens on truck drivers, and perhaps I'll talk more about that rule later. But that will have $1.7 billion in savings, not to mention all of the hassle and annoyance that truckers have to face until now in filing those reports. These are the kinds of efforts that we see on an ongoing basis, and I think the way for the public to evaluate the retrospective review efforts is to look at those savings and to see the ongoing efforts to find them.
Thank you, Administrator. I yield back.
Mr. Hanna.
You mentioned the President's Quick Pay Initiative, which this committee is supported. But the Department of Defense, which is over 70% of subcontractors, about $51.8 billion, has decided to do away with that. And yet earlier in your conversation, you mentioned that they were committed to paying people more quickly. Can you respond to that?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Hand. I would have to go back and look at what the current status of the Department of Defense's implementation is. I'm not aware of that.
One other thing, I want to ask you, the idea of a cost-benefit analysis is by definition subjective. What does it mean to you? And what does it mean to your department? And is it really money, or is it subjective and more nuanced than that? And at what point do you decide that a regulation is or is not worth doing? What does that mean in real terms?
Well, I think what it means in real terms is this. What cost-benefit analysis should do is, to the extent possible, quantify the costs that a regulation will bring to the American public, but also the benefits in dollar terms that will be created. And in many cases, those benefits can be quantified. For example, when we talk about the forthcoming Department of Transportation DVIR rule, that is the retrospective rule that is going to lift certain inspection report requirements that truckers have to comply with every day. We can actually count the amount of time it takes a trucker to file that report every day, and you can quantify what the value of that is by knowing what the average hourly wage of a trucker is and how many truckers there are out there on the road.
But who decides when a rule is more expensive than the benefits derived?
Well, we can certainly look, to the extent benefits can be quantified, we can look and see what the costs are and measure them against the benefits. But to your point that there are often values that go beyond things that are easily quantifiable, that is a harder question. Certainly there are values beyond those that are quantifiable that do come into the evaluation of a regulation. And those might be, in some cases, hard to put a dollar value on. But I would note that those are also often values that are dictated by the underlying statute.
Do you have, on another note, getting back to quick pay and the President's directive, do you have the ability to go to the Department of Defense and ask them to follow the directive rather than abandon it to over 70% of their contracts? I mean, what would you say if you found out what I'm saying to you today is true, which we believe that it is?
Well, so OIRA does not have jurisdiction to go and enforce the law on executive departments. We review regulations as they come into us. Once the regulations are finalized and they're out there on the books, we are not an enforcement agency, so it would not be within our jurisdiction to go out and call them into account.
But let's say that you looked at that, which you will when you get back, I hope, and you discovered that it was a big expense to the small businesses that they're paying, but not paying in a timely fashion. What would you do? Would you just put it back in the drawer, or would you call this committee, or?
Well, it's not in our drawer. What we would hope is that small businesses would be making clear that the regulation is not working as they had hoped, and that the entities with the appropriate jurisdiction would investigate what was happening. What we would do is, if there was a regulation that was submitted to us by the Department of Defense that was changing their practices, we would review that regulation under our normal processes.
So that 70% of these contracts by small businesses that are out there that the Department of Defense has decided not to follow the quick pay rules, really what you're saying is they can do that and there's no recourse.
Well, no, that's not what I'm saying at all, sir. Just to be,
Gentleman yield?
Yeah,
I would
of course.
suggest that the small businesses, the contractors, reach out to the office of the IG. They have the jurisdiction to investigate whether or not the agency is complying with the rules.
Ms. Hahn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Velasquez. So we're 13 years into the 21st century, and yet we're only just beginning to develop the streamlined and modern government that the American people expect and deserve from the nation that invented the Internet. An important part of that is judicious and thorough reviews of our regulations, ensuring that our regulations have not grown outdated or duplicative, and making sure that we're cutting down on paperwork wherever we can. Since last Congress, I've actually had some legislation to make the Small Business Administration's pilot Small Loan Advantage program permanent. That pilot has streamlined applications for small loans of up to $350,000, cutting down their paperwork to only 2 pages. And I think that's the sort of thing that we should be doing across government. In particular, I think we need to do more to shift more of our compliance and regulatory infrastructure online and to improve our electronic filing. Last week in this committee, we had the head of the IRS talk about how severe budget cuts have been endured by the IRS, and that's meant that they've had to prioritize which tax forms they've moved to e-filing, and that means that some more exotic forms are getting pushed down the waiting line for next year or the year after. And the Commissioner noted that the people and the small businesses that still have to paper file these less common forms make a lot of noise about how especially burdensome and complicated they are and how much they would benefit from e-filing. But his budget limits him from helping them now. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think Congress needs to do to accelerate and support the shift towards e-filing and technology-based reporting across government? And what do you think is the greatest obstacles to moving towards e-filing and technology-based reporting? And are some of the agencies farther along or lagging behind than others in that respect?
Thank you very much for your questions, Congresswoman Hahn, because you've raised an issue that I think is very important to me as administrator and is very important to OIRA and OMB. Which is paperwork reduction, but also making the government more accessible and easier to use for American citizens. E-filing, electronic access to information are all part of that picture. To be sure, part of OIRA, part of the acronym is information, and so a lot of what we are concerned about is implementation of the Privacy Act, paperwork reduction. All kinds of online initiatives, of course, have to be balanced against concerns about privacy and data security, and I think those are things that the agencies are working together on very well. OMB is part of a broader interagency process that looks at all of these kinds of issues on an ongoing basis. And so consistent with the obligations of ensuring privacy, data security, it is a major priority to make this government simpler, more accessible. In terms of the particular priorities that an agency might have in moving towards electronic filing or electronic data availability, I can't speak to the particular agency's priorities. They have to set those consistent with their statutes, with their policy mandates, and with their resources. And so I think one of the things that I hope going forward is that the agencies will have the resources fully to continue their work on making government as user-friendly and as accessible as possible.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but I think one of the things we really, it's one thing to review these regulations and see where we might do a better job, but it's something if we're asking business to comply, and we're making it really difficult or burdensome for them to fill out forms, to show that they're in compliance. I just really feel like that's another part of what I'd like to see you also include as part of your reviews.
Thank you, and I agree entirely. One of the things that we do look at in all of our reviews is to see what the paperwork burdens are and to see that the agencies have done what is possible to reduce those burdens, and particularly pursuant to our particular concern for small businesses, to see what can be done to reduce the cost of small businesses that may not have the ability to hire somebody to be a paperwork person. We're very concerned about the way that this could actually become more costly for small businesses. So we do review agencies' efforts to try to reduce those burdens.
And make suggestions?
We make suggestions. We ask questions about why things might not be done other ways, but sometimes there are limits to the resources, to the technology, legal questions. But I can assure you that the agencies and certainly my office are very concerned with these issues.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, to help me understand some of your process, agency is working on a reg set, rule set. What do you do methodology in your office? What are your steps you go through to review?
Well, at the point that the agency is actually engaged in the rulemaking process, the rulemaking process is at the agency. And so in most cases, it is a notice and comment rule process that's there at the agency, not with my office.
In your shop, what are your steps? What do you do?
So after the agency feels that it has its rule, whether it's a proposed rule or a final rule or some kind of advance notice of a rule, when they feel they have that document ready, they notify my office and say, we'd like to transmit this, or we're going to transmit this rule to you. They then upload the rule on our system, and it becomes public at that point what the rule is and that it is with OIRA. And this is following a public notice and comment period at the agencies.
Okay, so at this point, you're a bulletin board. What do you do next?
We then take the rule in, and we're much more than a bulletin board. I've got
What do you do next?
It will go to the relevant branch, and an analyst will sit down with the rule and start working through what is this rule designed to accomplish. What other rules might be doing what this rule is doing? What other agencies might have an interest?
Okay, at that point, so you have a researcher and an analyst
Yes.
going over the rule. What tools is that researcher to go over and say, a version of this rule already is in the reg sets here. This is duplicative. So when they're doing I'm trying to understand the mechanics of how do you actually do your analysis and find either things that are wonderful or things that are ultimately bad acts?
So there's several components of the analysis. One would be the question of, is this a rule that relates to other rules that might already exist or rules that other agencies are either promulgating or have promulgated? And that's where we convene the interagency process to make sure that this isn't duplicative or conflicting.
Okay, so at that moment, you're telling me the analyst is not doing the research themselves, but they're bringing together representatives who cover other agencies to provide the input?
If there is something in a rule that might implicate the activities of another agency, the most efficient course of action is to say to those other agencies, because they know much more what they are up to, and they will know much better what rules they are enforcing. How does this rule interact with what you do?
So your analyst doesn't first do a search, a public document search of that subject area, that specialty area, or common regulatory literature and first builds the box around it?
No, the rule comes to the analyst with explanations of why the rule is being promulgated, what other rules are out there, and the analyst is researching this.
So, well, you're saying two different things, and maybe I'm not understanding, so work with me here. The analyst is given this information from the agency, right?
The analyst is given a draft rule.
Okay, and is the analyst actually doing the research, or is the analyst reading someone else's research?
The analyst is doing both. It's not an either-or. The analyst will be doing research. The analyst will be reviewing the cost analysis and the benefit analysis. And the analyst will be looking primarily for two things. And the two things that the analysts will be looking at primarily are, why is this rule being done and what other rules might be implicated? The analyst can do the analyst's own research, but also draw on other research that is submitted, comments that are submitted, the preamble to the rule. They're both there.
Okay. Well, one of the things I wanted to get to, and we're only down to about 40-some seconds now. Okay, so analyst now has done, the researcher read someone else's, and finds out the parts of the rules are duplicative. Do you have the authority area to reach out and say, hey, this rule is more modern, we need to find a way to eliminate the previous, or what happens in those sorts of cases?
Well, the question that is asked there is, why are there benefits to this rule given what's already out there? And this is where the very rigorous analysis comes into play.
Okay, now in our last 10 seconds, how often does that happen, and how often is the rule basically, the path of it ended because of that type of analysis?
The back and forth, the finding of questions, hard questions, happens on a daily basis at OIRA.
How often does a
time.
rule not move forward because of this analysis?
Well, it would depend what you mean by not move forward. If what you mean that...
It means it dies because it's duplicative or some other research you created.
Well, what happens is there is a back and forth between OIRA and the agency, and rules can change. They can be pulled back like the fiduciary rule and be repromulgated. The rule can be changed in response to comments and the review process.
And forgive me,
Quite
I'm way over
frequently.
time. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Chairman.
Trying to figure out what, we're going to have a long series of votes. I know we've got several members that are left to ask questions. Anybody have anything that they need pressing asked? If so, speak now or will.
I'll try to be brief, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman. I just wanted to have an opportunity, since I probably can't come back if we reconvene. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for convening this hearing. As a small business owner, I know from our experience, my wife and I's experience, 22 years small business owners, that we just have to make every effort to get direct input from small business owners and feedback on what's working and what's not working. That's why I meet regularly with small business. It's the only way I can do this job effectively. And part of the retrospective review process that federal agencies are already implementing on an ongoing basis to review regulations requires that they solicit input from the public, from the general public. And I believe the most crucial component of any regulatory review process is that kind of direct feedback. But it seems to me that each agency is pretty much interpreting the standards as they see fit and differently. While some are going to communities in a very open way and talking to people who are really interested in the issues, others print their review process on their website in such fine print you have to take a magnifying glass to read it. It seems to me that so many agencies are basically closed to public input and closed to members of the public who have an interest in their regulations. Can you tell the committee what guidance your office is providing to federal agencies regarding public input and what it should look like, and how we can better ensure that we don't just have a process that's in name only, but a real process that gets input from the public?
Thank you, Mr. Barber. I think you've raised the critical issue of transparency and the openness of the regulatory process to the public. And I agree, and OIRA agrees, that it's absolutely critical that rulemaking be as open and accessible as possible to all members of the public. And that would mean, especially for the reasons that you provided, the small business community. As a general matter, the rulemakings that come to us have been through a very open notice and comment period. Now, it may well be the case that different agencies have different levels of resources or different institutionalized practices for reaching out specifically to small businesses and therefore can get more input. I think it is of vital importance for small businesses to encourage such efforts, to get their associations or to get their coalitions to focus on the agency actions. I applaud the efforts of this committee to apprise small businesses of specific regulatory actions that are pending that small businesses might want to pay attention to. I couldn't agree with you more that making sure that the process is open and accessible is paramount. And the guidance that we at OIRA give to agencies is precisely that.
Can you say what more you think you can do in your new position to really make sure that they get it, that it's just not some kind of a process that really doesn't mean anything, that's, you know, in name only and kind of generally follows the law, but really doesn't get at the heart of what public wants to say?
Well, I think what we can do, since our experience is that most agencies really do follow the notice and comment period, or notice and comment process. Indeed, their regulations are quite vulnerable if they don't follow that process, and I think they understand that. So it's very much in their interests to ensure that the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act are followed. What we can do is to encourage and to ask what small business input was received. What efforts were made to respond to that? How did that factor into your analyses? These are the kinds of questions that we at OIRA can ask and will ask, and I believe that those can help to focus attention on precisely the issues you raise.
Well, I encourage you to be even more vigilant, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I'd ask that any other members that have questions that please submit them, and I would hope that Mr. Shalansky, you'd answer them in a very timely manner and get back to us on that, since we do have a series of votes and we won't keep you through that series of votes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves, and I would be pleased to respond in a timely manner.
Well, I want to thank you for testifying today. You know, reducing unnecessary regulations or regulatory burdens, I guess, is critically important to small businesses when they're trying to compete and trying to create jobs in a competitively global economy. And these retrospective reviews can yield results, but only if it's taken seriously. And I hope you use your office and your position to ensure that the agencies are taking it seriously and trying to do just that. And I hope you'll update us too periodically, if you would, on the progress of this and how it's obviously affecting small businesses. And with that, I want to thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. This is just to end on the note by ensuring you that small businesses are very much at the heart of this administration's concern with growing the economy, creating jobs, and it's very much a focus of my office.
Well, with that, I would ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, that is so ordered. And with that, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.